Hey there. Welcome to Dark Lullabies. How was your day? I'm so glad you're here, and I really hope I can help you relax and find some peace tonight. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Okay, let's get started with the first story. Story 1. The Green Marks on the Ridge. I wasn't a popular kid in college, and honestly, I wasn't even trying to be. I went to a small state school tucked into the Appalachian mountains of West Virginia, the kind of place where the campus buildings were old red brick and the air always smelled faintly like wood smoke and diesel. I didn't join any clubs. I wasn't in a fraternity. There weren't many to choose from anyway, and my grades were average on a good semester. I spent most of those years just trying to get through classes and not think too hard about how lonely I felt. Things are different now. I'm in my late 30s, working a decent job, living in a little house at the edge of town with my fiancée and our dog, a rescue mutt who thinks he owns the couch. I'm planning to propose officially this fall, ring and all, even though she already knows it's coming. Life is good in a way I never thought it would be. But every now and then, when the wind comes down off the ridge just right and the night gets too quiet, I remember that one party, and the way those people looked at our necks like they were checking price tags. Back then, my world was basically two friends and a lot of empty time to kill. My closest friends were Mason and Tyler. We weren't the fun guys on campus. While the football crowd and the Greek life kids were packing into cramped houses and yelling over bad country remixes, we were usually holed up in Mason's off-campus apartment, a cramped place above a muffler shop that rattled every time someone revved an engine. We played video games, split cheap beer, complained about professors and girlfriends we didn't have. We wanted to go to parties, sure, but we never knew the right people. And at a school that small, if you weren't already plugged in by freshman year, you were pretty much stuck on the outside looking in. Every once in a while, though, something would fall in our laps. One Friday evening near midterms, Tyler dropped a message into our group chat. Had been talking to a girl he met on some dating app, a girl he insisted was different, which was something he said about almost every girl that gave him more than 2 replies. Her name was Sierra, and according to him, Shed invited us to a get-together up on one of the ridges outside town, in a newer development where people with money built vacation cabins that looked like lodges. Shed sent him a pin, a long driveway off a county road we'd all driven past but never turned down. Mason joked that it sounded like the setup to every horror movie ever made in the mountains, but there was a twitch of excitement in his voice he couldn't hide. I remember looking at the drop pin on Tyler's cracked screen, a little red bubble in the middle of all that dark green map, and feeling half nervous, half desperate not to spend another Friday listening to trucks roar under Mason's floor. We didn't have much going for us socially, and when you're 20, that feels like a personal failure. It didn't take much to talk ourselves into going. Mason convinced his older brother, Luke, to drive us. Luke worked nights at the quarry and barely drank, so he was the natural designated driver. He rolled his eyes when we asked, but he had that bored, restless look people get after too many long shifts alone. And after a few minutes of us begging, he shrugged and said he'd take us as long as nobody puked in the truck. The sun was already sliding behind the ridgeline when we headed out. The sky over the mountains, turning that deep bruised purple you only get around there. As we wound along the 2-lane roads, we passed hollowed-out gas stations and front porches lit by blue televisions, the usual scattered signs of life you find tucked into the valleys. At one curve, Luke's headlights swept across a wooden roadside cross hammered into the ditch, fresh silk flowers tied to it with bright ribbon. Someone had draped a dark hoodie over the cross, the sleeves hanging down like arms. For a second, the light hit it just right, and I could have sworn it was a person just standing there, facing the road. Nobody said anything. But I felt the mood in the truck dip a little, like lead driven through something cold. Then Tyler broke the silence, complaining that Sierra hadn't texted him back in hours. That wasn't unusual for him. He lived in a constant state of she's ghosting me, but this time there was a panicked edge to it. He kept refreshing the app, swiping through messages, cursing under his breath. About halfway there, he suddenly cursed louder and said her profile was gone completely. No messages, no photo, like Shed been deleted off the app entirely. It could have been anything. She unmatched him. She deleted her account, but Tyler took it like a personal betrayal. He started saying maybe we should just turn around, that there was no point going if she wasn't answering. We were already deep into back roads by then, and none of us felt like admitting we'd come this far for nothing. So we told him to quit sulking, that even if Sierra bailed, there'd be other people there. Luke just kept driving, jaw set, headlights carving tunnels out of the dark. When we finally turned off onto the long gravel drive Sierra had sent, it felt like entering a different world. The trees opened up, and sitting on the ridge above the valley was a house, or I guess technically a cabin, if you squinted, that looked like it belonged in some glossy magazine. 3 stories of dark wood and glass, big wraparound porch, warm yellow light pouring out of every window. The houses we'd passed on the way up were modest, beat-up things, some with tarps on the roofs. This place looked like it had been helicopter dropped in from a ski resort out west. There were already a bunch of cars lined up along the tree line. SUVs, sedans with out-of-state plates, a couple of shiny pickups that definitely didn't belong to anyone from our campus. We could hear music drifting from inside, not loud enough to shake the siding, but steady, strange. It wasn't the usual mix of country, rap, and early 2000s throwbacks that played at every backyard bonfire around our school. It sounded distant. Layers of synth, slow and pulsing, with some weird vocal samples washed so deep in reverb you couldn't catch any words. We all climbed out of the truck, and Tyler immediately announced he needed a buzz before he could face whatever this is. None of us argued. Luke pulled the truck into a spot a little further down the drive, half hidden by a cluster of pines, and we stood around the tailgate, passing cheap beer back and forth, watching people trickle up to the house. They were not like us. Most of them were dressed nicer than you'd ever see at a normal college party. Women in fitted dresses and long coats, men in pressed shirts, boots that weren't scuffed to hell, even a few slim black blazers. They talked in low, amused voices, laughing at things that weren't really jokes, as if they were all sharing a conversation we weren't invited into. Tyler drank the most, muttering about Sierra under his breath, until the edge came off his sulking and he started acting like his usual loud self again. Eventually, we decided we'd delayed long enough and headed toward the porch. I remember thinking, as we climbed the wide wooden steps, that the air smelled different up there. The usual damp leaf and dirt smell of the mountains was still there, but underneath it was something sharper, like cleaning chemicals and perfume. When we stepped inside, the first thing that hit me was the light. Every room I could see from the foyer was lit up bright, not with warm lamps or strings of party lights, but with overhead fixtures and recessed lighting that made the whole place feel almost clinical. No shadows to hide in, no dim corners, just a crowd of strangers washed in soft white. People milled around, holding glasses instead of red cups, talking in clusters, glancing up when we came in and then away again just as quickly. It looked less like a college party and more like a fundraiser hosted by someone's rich parents. I could feel my thrift store flannel and scuffed sneakers like a costume I'd forgotten was supposed to be funny. The music was louder inside. That same slow, drifting, instrumental kind of sound, almost like what you'd hear in some trendy lounge. But there was something off about it. Every so often, underneath the main melody, a distant, almost chanted voice would surface for half a second and then sink back down, like someone talking from the bottom of a swimming pool. I told myself I was overthinking it. Free alcohol is free alcohol. There were bottles on a long wooden counter that might have been a kitchen island and a couple of coolers on the floor, so Mason and I drifted that way and poured ourselves whatever was closest. People watched us in this oddly direct way, eyes tracking us for just a second too long before they went back to their own conversations. It was subtle enough that I could have chalked it up to insecurity, but it happened so often that I started wondering if I had something on my face. I kept licking my teeth, rubbing at my mouth when I thought no one was looking. Once, when I leaned against the wall near the kitchen, I caught a whiff of something strong coming from a side door off the main hall. It was propped open, a crack, and through it I saw a set of stairs leading down and a concrete floor under harsh light. There were big plastic storage tubs stacked against the wall, and in the middle of the floor, a circular metal drain with a hose coiled next to it. The smell of bleach and something faintly metallic drifted up. Before I could stare too long, someone inside, just a blur of a shoulder in a white shirt, pushed the door shut with the back of their hand. The latch clicked with a finality that made the back of my neck prickle. I told myself it was just a utility room, maybe a laundry area where they washed the sheets between rentals, and went back to my drink. A little while later, just when we'd started to loosen up despite ourselves, a trio of girls approached us. It almost never happened to us back on campus, so it was like something had shifted in our favor for once. They were all dressed better than anyone we usually talk to. Black dresses, simple jewelry, hair done like they'd actually tried. Their smiles were immediate and a little too bright. One of them, a brunette with sharp eyes and a laugh that came easily, drifted closer to me. She said her name was Hannah, and even though I told myself not to read into anything, I liked the way she didn't seem bothered by how out of place we looked. They joked about how there was an unofficial cover charge and lifted a bottle of tequila one of them was holding. The joke didn't land like a joke, but the bottle was right there, and we were three guys desperate not to seem lame. They tilted it up for us in turn. The tequila burned its way down, harsh and cheap, and I could feel the warmth move out through my chest and into my face. After that, the six of us stuck together for a while, drinking, talking over the strange music, pretending like we were part of whatever this was. I don't remember everything we talked about. I just remember feeling that rare, weightless sense that maybe just for one night I wasn't the invisible kid at the fringe of the room. At some point, I noticed a small, sharp line on the side of Hannah's neck. It was maybe an inch long, a thin stripe of deep, unnatural green, like someone had drawn it there with a permanent marker in one clean stroke. It was too straight to be a random smudge and too vivid to be a vein or a shadow. If I hadn't been standing so close, I never would have seen it under the overhead lights. My brain tried to file it under weird tattoo or some kind of makeup, but it didn't look like either. It just sat there, this perfect little bar of color against her skin, and once I saw it, I couldn't stop glancing at it. I thought about asking, but every way of phrasing the question sounded rude in my head. And the last thing I wanted was to offend the only girl who'd paid attention to me in months. So I swallowed the curiosity and focused instead on her hands around her drink, the way she angled her body toward mine when she laughed. Eventually, the group thinned. I saw Mason disappear up the broad wooden staircase with the girl head, been talking to his shoulders more squared than usual. And a little while after, Tyler and his girl drifted that same direction, her hand resting light on his arm. I was happy for them, if I'm honest. It was nice to see them win for once. Being alone with Hannah, though, ratcheted my nervousness up. Even with the alcohol, I could feel sweat at the base of my neck and that old familiar fear that it'd say something stupid and shatter the fragile impression that I knew what I was doing. I mumbled something about needing the bathroom, told her it'd be right back, and she smiled like she believed me. I had to circle halfway through the house to find a bathroom, and when I did, the door was closed with a thin line of light showing underneath. I leaned against the wall to wait, listening to that strange music flow in from the other rooms. It pulsed slow enough that it almost matched my heartbeat. A few minutes later, the door opened, and a tall man stepped out. He was older than most people there, maybe mid-30s, with neatly trimmed hair and a white button-down shirt tucked into light-colored linen pants. He smelled like expensive cologne, the kind of scent that lingers in the air behind someone. I moved to slip past him into the bathroom, but he didn't move. He just stood in the doorway, looking at me, eyes traveling over my face and then down to my throat like he was checking something off a list. There was nothing friendly or drunk about his expression. It was flat, assessing. It took me a second to realize he had the same kind of mark on his neck that Hannah did. Same exact green. Same length, same orientation. A neat little line almost glowing against his skin. Seeing it twice made it feel less like an accident and more like a code I hadn't been told about. He said something to me, something along the lines of wanting to know who had brought us, who we were with, and his tone made it clear it wasn't casual small talk. I don't know why I told him the truth instead of just saying a random name. Maybe the tequila loosened my tongue. Or maybe I was still hoping Sierra would materialize out of nowhere and make this whole night make sense. I told him Wed been invited by a girl named Sierra, that Shed sent the pin. For a split second, something in his expression changed. Not surprise, exactly. More like recognition mixed with irritation. He glanced past me toward the stairs, then over my shoulder toward the main room like he was checking that no one else had heard. When his eyes came back to mine, the faint trace of a smile headed was gone. The music swelled somewhere behind us and someone laughed in another room. But up there in that narrow hallway, it felt like the air had dropped a few degrees. He said Sierra's name slowly, like he was tasting it, then made a vague gesture toward the party and asked if I saw her anywhere. I knew I didn't, and hearing him point it out made my stomach twist. Before he could say anything else, he stepped aside just enough for me to squeeze into the bathroom. I shut the door a little harder than I meant to, my hands suddenly shaky. I stared at my reflection for a long time, listening to the muffled thump of the music. My face was flushed, my eyes too wide. I splashed water on my cheeks, telling myself I was being paranoid, that the marks were some weird party thing, like wristbands at a club. But it didn't explain why I hadn't seen anyone actually mark themselves, or why the older guy had looked at me the way he did. When I stepped back out, the hallway was empty. The air felt strangely still, like the house was holding its breath. I headed down the stairs, weaving through groups of people. Something in me had shifted. Instead of just trying to blend in, I was actively scanning. I started looking closely at people's necks as they passed by. Most were bare, just skin and jewelry, nothing unusual. But every so often, I'd catch a flash of that same deep green line, on a woman by the kitchen, on a man standing near the back doors, on one guy leaning in close to another guest, smiling a smile that didn't reach his eyes. All of the lines were identical. Same thickness, same placement, like they'd been stamped on in a factory. Once, when a man in a dark blazer turned his head to say something to the person next to him, I saw a second line just below the first, faintly red, as if someone had drawn another color over the original and it hadn't fully taken yet. It was there for a moment and then gone as he shifted, swallowed by the collar of his shirt. My heart was doing this slow, heavy pounding now, the kind that makes it hard to catch a full breath. I decided I needed to find Mason and Tyler and leave, even if they'd complain the whole ride home. As I searched, I cut through what looked like a walk-through pantry to save time. The shelves were lined with neat rows of liquor bottles and cases of glassware, all labeled like a restaurant stockroom. At the far end of the narrow space, there was another door, slightly ajar, with a thin strip of brighter light beneath it. I heard a sound from the other side, soft, irregular, like someone trying and failing to steady their breathing. For a second, it sounded almost like quiet crying, the kind you hear in bathroom stalls after a party has gone wrong. I considered knocking, but before I could move, the light under the door shifted and the sound cut off abruptly. The silence that followed was worse. I had this sudden image of someone standing just inches away from the door, listening as closely as I was. I backed away, turned, and went the long way around to the stairs instead. Luckily, as I started up, I saw Mason and Tyler coming down toward me. Their faces were flushed, their shirts a little rumpled, and they both wore the smug half-grins of guys who think they've finally caught a break. Relief hit me so hard I almost hugged them. Instead, I grabbed their sleeves and steered them into a quieter corner off the main hall, away from the bar and the clusters of watching eyes. I told them quickly what I'd noticed: the marks on Hannah's neck, on the older guy, the bleach smell from downstairs, the multiple people with identical lines. Saying it out loud made it sound a little crazier, but not enough to dismiss. They laughed at first, of course. Mason told me it always had too active an imagination and that I was probably just drunk. Tyler said I was jealous, that just because my night hadn't gone upstairs like theirs didn't mean I had to invent some creepy conspiracy to ruin it for them. Then I told him about the man in the hallway asking Hud brought us and the way Head said Sierra's name. That wiped some of the humor off Mason's face. He frowned, asked more questions. Tyler still wasn't buying it. He said our hookups had told them to meet back upstairs in a few minutes, that if we left now, we'd look like idiots. While we argued, Tyler shifted his weight from foot to foot, agitated, his hand going absent-mindedly to his neck like it itched. That's when I saw it. On the side of his throat, just above the curve of his collarbone, was a thin, straight, red line. Same length as the green marks he'd seen. Same precise placement, only this one looked fresher, like it had been drawn there not long before. My words died in my throat. I stepped closer before he could flinch away and told him to hold still. He kept making jokes about love bites until he realized I wasn't laughing. Mason came in to look, and his expression shifted from amusement to something closer to fear. I turned to Mason and pushed up the collar of his shirt. There, a little higher on his neck, was another red line, mirror image to Tyler's. They both tried to explain it away. Maybe it was lipstick. Maybe the girls had drawn on them as some flirty joke. But the lines were too precise, too identical. Not smudgy, not shaky from someone laughing while they did it. Clean, deliberate. I told them I was done playing around, that we were leaving and we could argue about my paranoia later in the truck. Mason, to his credit, didn't fight me much after seeing the marks. Tyler, though, dug his heels in. He kept saying he wanted to at least go upstairs and say goodbye so he didn't look like a coward. We were in the middle of that back and forth when a man I hadn't seen before walked down the hallway toward us. He was around the same age as the guy I'd met near the bathroom, though shorter, with a narrow face and a fitted dark blazer. As he passed, his gaze skimmed over each of us in turn, not lingering on our eyes, but dropping immediately to our throats. His jaw moved a little, like he was grinding his teeth, and there was a faint tick in his cheek. On his own neck, just visible above the open collar of his shirt, was that same deep green line. For a moment, it felt like we were animals, being checked for tags. He didn't say anything, just gave the smallest of nods, like head confirmed something to himself, and continued past us. That was it for Mason. He grabbed Tyler's arm and said we were leaving, no discussion. I didn't argue. As we crossed the living room toward the front door, I could feel eyes on us again, the way you feel a draft without seeing the window open. Conversations didn't stop, but there was a subtle shift, a ripple in the air as people's heads turned, as if word traveled faster than we were on our feet. Near the front entrance, on a small table set under a framed landscape painting, there was a neat stack of printed flyers for some neighborhood safety initiative, with a date and time for a meeting at the local community center. On top of that stack, half tucked under the others like it had been dropped there in a hurry, was a missing person flyer. A woman in her early 20s, dark hair, serious eyes. The photo was grainy, probably pulled off a social media profile, but there was something disturbingly familiar about her face. I couldn't place it until we were already on the porch, the cold air hitting my lungs. Then it clicked. She looked like one of the women I'd seen earlier that night by the kitchen, laughing with a group of guests, head tilted back, no green mark on her neck that I could remember. I told myself I was mixing people up, but the image of that flyer stayed burned in my mind as we hurried down the steps. We practically ran the rest of the way to Luke's truck. He was sitting behind the wheel, scrolling on his phone, truck idling low. When he saw our faces, he didn't bother with questions. He just put it in reverse and backed down the gravel drive, the house shrinking in the side mirror until it was just a rectangle of light in the dark. As we hit the main road, both Mason's and Tyler's phones started vibrating almost in unison. Notifications lit up their screens. Messages from the girls they'd gone upstairs with, asking where they'd gone, why they'd left, telling them to come back inside. Some of the texts were weirdly specific, saying they shouldn't be outside in the dark like that, as if whoever was sending them knew exactly where we were. Mason and Tyler looked at each other and then, without saying much, blocked the numbers. Nobody spoke for the rest of the ride. The radio stayed off, and the only sounds were the engine, the hum of the tires, and the occasional rattle from something loose in the truck bed. When we passed the roadside cross again, the headlights caught it the same way as before. But this time, it just looked like what it was. A marker for someone who hadn't made it home one night. We graduated, drifted away from each other mostly, moved on with our lives. But that night sits in my memory like a stone at the bottom of a river, always there, no matter how much time and new water rushes over it. Over the years, when I've told this story to my fiancée, to a couple of friends over beers. Everyone has their own theory. Some say it was just a weird rich kid party with some kind of insider marking system for who was in and who wasn't. Others think it was something uglier, tied to trafficking or blackmail. That the green and red lines meant more than we ever got the chance to find out. Maybe the bleach smell and the locked doors were nothing. Maybe the missing girl flyer was just my mind trying to stitch random details into a pattern. All I know is the way that man's eyes moved over our necks, the precision of those marks, and the sick feeling in my stomach when I realized my friends had been tagged while they'd been worrying about the bathroom. I still see Hannah sometimes in my dreams. Not her face exactly, just the line of her throat and that thin green bar like a silent warning I was too young and too eager to understand. I'm grateful we left when we did, even if I'll never know what we walked away from. If you think you can piece together what was really going on up on that ridge, or if something like this has ever happened near you, tell me in the comments. I've been replaying that night for almost 20 years, and I still don't know which explanation scares me the most. Story 2. The Man with My Keys. I was 24 the first time I really understood what it feels like to be watched. Not in the casual way you notice eyes on you in a crowded room, but in that deep, unnerving way where you start to doubt your own memory, your own senses, and even your own apartment. Back then, I was a grad student in civil engineering at a small university buried in the Appalachian mountains of eastern Kentucky. The campus sat in a narrow valley, all red brick and steel against rolling green hills and old coal scars. I rented a cheap one-bedroom on the edge of town, in a sagging two-story building that backed up to a patch of woods and a set of disused train tracks. The place smelled faintly of mildew and fried food no matter how many candles I burned, but it was what I could afford. My landlord, a guy named Mr. Henson, lived in Florida and managed everything over the phone through some cousin who checked on things when he could. I had my car, a beat-up Honda that hated cold mornings, and a schedule full of labs and late nights. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt like progress. For a while, everything was normal in that boring, unremarkable way you don't appreciate until it's gone. The turning point came on a Thursday, in the most mundane way possible. It had back-to-back classes and ducked into an empty lecture hall between them to cram some notes and answer emails. The room was one of those older ones. Long, creaky desks, humming fluorescent lights, a faint chalk dust smell that never really left. I dropped my backpack on a table near the middle row and went to use the restroom down the hall. I wasn't gone more than 5 minutes. When I came back, the bag was gone. At first, I just stood there, staring at the empty spot like ID misremembered where I'd set it. Then I checked every row, the floor, even behind the podium. Nothing. No cameras in the hall. No one in the hallway who'd seen anything, just my heart pounding harder with each passing second. My whole life was in that bag, my wallet, my apartment keys, my laptop, which I'd stupidly set to auto-login. I spent the rest of the day canceling cards, calling the campus lost and found, and filing a report with campus police that I already knew wouldn't go anywhere. They were sympathetic, but without cameras or witnesses, there was nothing to trace. I told myself it was just bad luck, that someone had grabbed an easy opportunity and I was the idiot who gave it to them. But a thief isn't just taking what's in your hands. Sometimes they're taking the comfort of knowing the line between your world and everyone else's is solid. It took a few days for that to sink in. The first thing that tipped me off that this was more than just a theft was a piece of paper. I'd driven home late from campus, headlights bouncing off trees and the occasional reflective road sign, mine still stuck on a problem set. The building's parking lot was half gravel, half mud, carved out behind the property like an afterthought. I parked, climbed the short concrete steps, and there it was. A folded note slipped just far enough under my apartment door that I had to bend down to pick it up. I assumed it was from Henson's cousin, maybe about rent, or the broken dryer in the basement. Inside was a single line in tight, neat handwriting. I see you. No name, no smiley face, no explanation. I stared at the words long enough for my thumb to smudge a little of the ink. That was when my brain finally put the pieces together. Whoever had taken my backpack hadn't just gotten my laptop and wallet. They'd gotten my address from my files, maybe my email, my class schedule, everything a stranger would need to map out my life. And they still had my keys. I remember unlocking the door with my spare and stepping inside with a kind of quiet, careful dread, like I expected someone to jump out from behind the couch. Nothing did. The place looked exactly the same as it had that morning. My unmade bed visible from the doorway, dishes in the sink, a pile of laundry on the chair. Still, I went room by room, closet by closet, checking under the bed, the shower curtain, even inside the kitchen cabinets. I didn't find anything, and the silence in that little apartment started to feel like it was laughing at me. I had a deadbolt the thieves didn't have a key for, so once I locked that, I could tell myself there was at least one barrier they couldn't cross. It helped a little, not a lot. Over the next week, more notes slipped under my door. They came at odd times when I was at class, when I was at the library late, sometimes between me going out for a grocery run and coming back 15 minutes later. They were always on the same kind of plain white paper, folded once, with short phrases written in that same neat hand. I know what you did. You don't lock as well as you think. Watch yourself. I hadn't done anything. I didn't have some secret past to blackmail me with, but that almost made it worse. The idea that a stranger was inventing a version of me in their head and punishing me for it felt like it'd been dropped into someone else's nightmare. I thought about going to the police, but I'd already tasted how little they could do when all you have is a stolen backpack and a few cryptic notes. Without forced entry, without a name, I didn't see how it would end in anything but a shrug. In the meantime, other things started happening. Small at first, easy to explain away if I wanted to. My shoes would be in a slightly different place by the door than where I remembered leaving them, angled in instead of out. A mug I swore I'd left in the sink would be rinsed and standing upside down on the counter, a faint ring of water still beneath it. Once, I came home and found my bedroom window cracked open a few inches, the cheap plastic blinds rustling just enough to whisper. I told myself I must have opened it the night before and forgotten. I even grabbed my phone to check the weather app to see if it had been cool enough to make that reasonable. It hadn't. The first time I really felt it cross the line from weird to wrong was late one night after I'd tried to reset every password and contact every service that could have been connected to my stolen laptop. My head hurt from staring at screens and my eyes burned. I brushed my teeth in the small bathroom, the mirror slightly warped on one edge, giving my reflection a funhouse bend if I stepped too far to the left. I spat, rinsed, and shut off the light, leaving the sink in darkness. 10 minutes later, when I went back in for some Advil, I flipped the switch and saw my toothbrush lying flat on the counter instead of standing in the cup where ID left it. The bristles were wet, and not just from earlier, there was a fresh, foamy smear of toothpaste along the porcelain, separate from the one I'd left. It was a tiny detail, stupidly small, but it felt like someone had leaned over my shoulder and breathed against my neck. I stood there, staring at that white smear. And for the first time, the idea that whoever was doing this hadn't just been in my apartment while I was gone, but might have been there while I was sleeping, really settled in. After that, sleep stopped being the refuge it used to be. Every creak of the old building pipe settling, upstairs neighbors moving, wind rattling the siding sounded like a footstep. More than once, I woke up at 3 or 4 in the morning, heart pounding, swearing. I'd heard something in the living room. I'd lie there in the dark, holding my breath, and picture someone standing just on the other side of my thin bedroom door, listening to me listen for them. One Friday, about 2 weeks after the initial theft, I came home to find my apartment not just slightly off, but gutted in a way that made any rational explanation impossible. The front door was still locked, deadbolt and all, no signs of forced entry. But when I stepped inside, my stomach dropped. My bed was stripped to the bare mattress, sheets and blanket piled on the floor. Every drawer in my dresser was yanked out and left, skewed, clothes spilling over the edges. My books had been pulled off the shelf and scattered, some opened and laid face down like someone had been looking for a hidden compartment. Even the couch cushions were slashed open, stuffing spilling onto the carpet like cheap snow. It didn't look like a random search. It looked like someone had been angry with the objects themselves. I called the police then, hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. 2 officers came, took photos, asked questions that all boiled down to one. Who would want to do this? I didn't know. Nothing major was missing, no TV, no game console, not that I had much worth stealing anyway. They checked the windows, the back door, the locks. No pry marks, no broken glass. One of them suggested maybe Id left the door unlocked and a transient had come through, which felt like a polite way of saying homeless addict. Another shrugged and reminded me that since nothing obvious was stolen and there was no way to prove who'd entered, their hands were kind of tied. They told me to call if anything else happened. As they left, one of them paused and told me to ask my landlord to replace the locks, just in case. I called Henson that night, and when he didn't pick up, I called again. Eventually I got his cousin, who acted like I was asking for a full remodel. He said, "Head, see about getting a locksmith out there sometime next week." And when I pushed, explaining that whoever had my old keys had clearly already been inside, he said flatly that since there was no sign of forced entry and no confirmed theft, it wasn't an emergency. If I wanted to change the locks sooner, I'd have to pay for it myself and then he'd see about approving the work so I didn't violate the lease. It was such an absurd response that for a second I wondered if Head really heard what I said. If I needed to repeat that someone had ripped up my sheets and cut open my couch. But he had. He just didn't care the way I needed him to. That sense of betrayal, realizing that the person who controlled the door between me and whoever wanted to walk through it couldn't be bothered, settled on me heavier than I expected. The second horror detail came the next morning, when I tried to put my room back together. As I pushed my bed away from the wall so I could tuck clean sheets around the corners, I noticed a strange, flattened patch in the carpet inside the small closet across from the foot of my bed. It was like something heavy had been sitting in the same spot for a long time, pressed into the fibers. On the floor, half tucked behind a stack of old textbooks, were 2 crumpled energy bar wrappers I didn't recognize, and an empty plastic bottle that smelled faintly of urine when I unscrewed the cap without thinking. On the inside of the closet door, at about eye level if you were sitting on the floor, were 3 small, worn indentations, like someone had rested their head back there over and over. The idea formed slowly, sickeningly. Someone had been sitting in that closet for long enough to eat, drink, and need a place to relieve themselves, with my bed not 6 feet away. I pictured myself asleep, the thin apartment door shut but not locked because I'd always thought the deadbolt was enough. While a stranger listened to my breathing through a sheet of cheap, hollow-core wood, I didn't throw the bottle away right away. Part of me thought about saving it as evidence, something the cops couldn't shrug off. But the more I stared at it, the more I just wanted it out of my home. I double-bagged it and dumped it in the shared trash bin outside, then stood there longer than necessary, just breathing open air. That day, I skipped all my classes. I called in sick to my TA session, claiming a stomach bug, which wasn't entirely a lie if you counted the way my nerves made me want to throw up. I spent the day cleaning, trying to reclaim the room in a way that made it feel like mine again. Washing every piece of bedding, rearranging the furniture so the bed no longer lined up perfectly with the closet door, propping a chair under the front doorknob even with the deadbolt set. I watched the light move across the floor as the sun shifted over the ridge, counting down the hours until nightfall with a dread that felt childish and completely justified at the same time. That evening, as the last of the daylight leaked out of the thin curtains and the woods behind the building turned into a dark mass, I sat on the floor with my back against the far wall, facing the door. I left the lamp off, letting the room be lit only by the orange glow from the street lamp outside, filtering through the blinds. The deadbolt was locked, the chair wedged under the knob, my phone in my hand, with 911 ready to dial. I wasn't sure what I was hoping for. Part of me wanted nothing to happen, for the silence to stretch until I felt stupid and could laugh about how paranoid it'd become. Another part of me wanted whoever this was to try to give me something concrete to point to fight against. I sat there until my legs went numb, until the sounds of other people in the building, muffled TV, distant shower, footsteps overhead blurred into background noise. It was after midnight when I heard it, a soft, slow scratching at my door, like something metal dragging lightly across cheap wood. It would scratch, pause, scratch again, as if the person on the other side was trying to be quiet and failing just enough for me to hear. The deadbolt rattled once, gently, as though the handle had been tested by a hand that already knew it wouldn't turn. My heart was pounding so loud I half expected whoever was outside to hear it. I didn't move. I didn't want the sound of shifting weight or creaking floorboards to give away my position. The scratching stopped, replaced by a faint rustle like paper against the floor. A moment later, a folded note slid into view under the tiny gap at the bottom of the door, pushing aside a bit of dust. I waited, counting to 60, then another 60, straining my ears for retreating footsteps. There were none that I could distinguish, just the normal settling sounds of the old building. When I finally crawled forward and snatched the note up, my hands were shaking hard enough to rattle the paper. Inside, in the same careful handwriting, were 4 words: "You look tired tonight." That simple sentence hit harder than any of the others, because it told me exactly what Id suspected and tried not to fully believe. This person wasn't just entering when I was gone. They were close enough, often enough, to see me at my most vulnerable, to judge the circles under my eyes, the slump of my shoulders. They weren't guessing, they were observing. The third and final detail that sealed it for me came the next day, when I decided I couldn't sit and wait anymore. I left the light on in the living room, the TV at a low volume, and a half-drunk glass of water on the coffee table, trying to make it look like Id just stepped out for a minute. Then I slipped out the back entrance of the building instead of the front, walked a few blocks like I was heading toward campus, and doubled around through the woods to watch my own building from the ridge. It felt ridiculous, sneaking around like that, branches snagging my jeans, dead leaves crunching under my feet. I settled behind a thick tree with a clear view of my windows and waited, the cold air threading through my jacket. For a long time, nothing happened. Cars came and went from the lot. A dog barked somewhere down the hill. Once, a train clattered along the disused tracks, slower than I thought possible, like the engineer was afraid of waking something up. I was starting to think Id misjudged everything when I saw him. A man walked slowly up the path to the front of my building, hood pulled up, hands in his pockets. He didn't go to any other unit, just straight to mine, glancing once over his shoulder toward the trees. Even from a distance, that one gesture made my skin crawl. He stood at my door for a long moment, then leaned his head slightly to the side, as if listening. After a few seconds, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. They caught the light as he turned one in my lock with a practiced motion, like he'd done it 100 times before. He never even tried the knob first. He went straight for the right key. That was all I needed to see. I called the police from my spot on the hill, voice low, giving them my address, telling them there was an intruder inside my apartment right now with stolen keys. My hands were shaking so badly I had to repeat myself twice. To their credit, they took it seriously this time. 2 cruisers rolled up faster than I expected. I watched officers go in with flashlights and guns drawn, my heart thudding so hard it almost drowned out the crunch of gravel under their boots. They were inside for what felt like forever. When they finally brought someone out, it wasn't some monstrous figure from a nightmare. It was just a guy in his late 30s, scruffy, gaunt, in dirty jeans and a jacket 2 sizes too big. I didn't recognize him, but that didn't mean anything. One of the officers later told me had been found in my bedroom, standing in front of my open closet, facing the space where my bed had been before I rearranged the furniture. In his pocket were my old keys and a folded piece of paper with my class schedule printed from my own computer. I never found out everything Head done in that apartment, or how many nights Head been there while I slept. The police said Head probably been the one to grab my backpack from the lecture hall, that Head used the laptop to dig through my accounts for anything useful, then taken an interest in me that went beyond identity theft. They tossed around words like obsessive and fixation, and though they never said the word stalker outright, it hung there unspoken. My landlord finally changed the locks after that, more worried about liability than my safety, and I moved out as soon as I could scrape together enough for a deposit somewhere else. Even now, years later, in a different city with better doors and a building that actually has security cameras, I feel a little spike of adrenaline every time I come home and see a piece of paper on the floor near my door. My rational brain knows it's probably just junk mail or a flyer. But there's another part that remembers a neat, careful handwriting telling me it could see me, commenting on how tired I looked, claiming space inside what should have been mine, alone. People hear this story and immediately jump to what they would have done. Filed reports sooner, demanded better locks, bought a camera, gotten a gun. Maybe they're right. Maybe I should have trusted my fear earlier. Treated those little inconsistencies not as quirks of memory, but as warnings. I still think about the flattened carpet in that closet and the toothbrush that wasn't where I left it. And I wonder how many nights I slept while a stranger sat just a few feet away, waiting for me to stop moving. If you'd been in my shoes back then, in that tiny Appalachian apartment with someone out there holding your keys and your schedule and who knows what else, what would you have done differently? Tell me in the comments, because I still replay those days in my head, and sometimes I'm not sure if I was paranoid or not nearly paranoid enough. Story 3. The mask behind the screen. I used to think the worst part of a breakup was the silence afterward, the empty space where someone's constant messages used to be. But that was before I learned how much louder things can get when the wrong person decides you're their favorite obsession. Back then, I was a junior at a small university tucked into the Appalachian Mountains of western North Carolina, a place where the football stadium backed right up to the tree line and fog clung to the valley most mornings like it didn't want to let go. And I was living in a tired old 2-story building just off campus, the kind where you could hear every argument and every shower your neighbors took because the walls might as well have been paper. My apartment was on the 2nd floor, a 1-bedroom with thin windows that looked out over a gravel alley and then straight into the dark of the mountain. And I told myself I liked being able to hear everything outside because it made me feel less alone. At the time, it just ended a 2-year relationship with a guy named Evan, who on paper was one of the sweetest people you could meet, soft-spoken, helpful, always willing to pick me up from late lectures or bring me coffee during exam week, and we didn't implode in some dramatic movie-style fight. It was more like a long, slow unraveling of tiny resentments and arguments we never really fixed, until one night we finally admitted we weren't making each other better anymore. Just tired. I blocked him on everything afterward, not because he'd done something unforgivable, but because I knew myself well enough to know that if I kept reading his late-night apologies, it'd get sucked back in. It hurt in that deep, dull way heartbreak does. But for a little while at least, it felt like the kind of pain you can heal from. A few nights after the breakup, I started to notice sounds at night that didn't quite fit with the usual soundtrack of my building. It wasn't just the distant rumble of trucks on the highway or the occasional drunk group coming back from the strip of bars near campus. This was different. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the gravel below my window. The crunching of rock and glass like someone was pacing instead of passing by. Then silence. Then a faint mechanical click that sounded exactly like a camera shutter. Once I even saw a flash reflected in the black glass of my turned-off TV. Just a split second of white that didn't match the dull street lamp glow outside. I froze on my couch and stared at the curtains, willing myself not to move. And the next morning, when I finally worked up the courage to pull the blinds all the way up, there was a smudged mark near the bottom pane of the window, a faint oval the size of a nose pressed to the glass. And just below it, the faint streaks of breath dried in arcs like someone had leaned in close to see better. I cleaned it off and told myself it was nothing, maybe just my own breath from looking out the night before. But I started triple-checking the lock on that window every night anyway. The timing couldn't have been worse because I was in the middle of this massive group project for one of my media-heavy gen ed classes. And even though my major was psychology, it always liked messing around with video editing. So my professor had given our group the option of doing a short documentary-style piece instead of a traditional paper. I was the one in charge of pulling everyone's footage together, color correcting, adding titles and music, all the nerdy, behind-the-scenes things I secretly loved. It was also a huge chunk of our grade, and I'd been living in Adobe Premiere more than in my own head for a few weeks straight. The night before our presentation, I stayed up late in my dim living room, laptop balanced on the coffee table, blinds half closed, the murmur of people talking and a dog barking down in the alley drifting through the thin glass. At one point, sometime after 11:30, my eyes were burning from staring at the timeline, so I leaned back and shut them for a second, hand resting on the edge of the trackpad. When I opened them again, the cursor was moving on its own. It slid up to the menu bar, hesitated, then dropped down the side of the screen and hovered over a folder I kept buried under other innocuous names. A folder that had photos and videos from nights with Evan Id never meant for anyone else to see. My first thought was that my trackpad was glitching. Maybe there was a driver issue. But then I watched as the cursor double-clicked with this precise, mechanical rhythm, the way you do when you know exactly what you're opening, and the thumbnail previews began to populate in neat little rows. I snapped the laptop shut so fast it made a cracking sound and just sat there, heart pounding, listening to the hard drive spin down in the quiet. I told myself I was being dramatic, that maybe my finger had pressed something without me realizing, that it was late and my brain was fried, and I forced myself to reopen the computer, finished exporting the project, and emailed the final file to my professor just before midnight, like we'd agreed. I remember crawling into bed with this exhausted relief, like at least one thing in my life was under control, even if the rest was a mess. The next day, our class was scheduled to present the videos in a big lecture hall that always smelled faintly like old coffee and dry erase markers. I sat with my group near the front, my stomach doing little nervous flips, but also a small, mean. Part of me was proud. It put a lot of work into making our piece look professional, and I knew it was better than most student projects. When it was our turn, my professor, Dr. Collins, pulled up his email on the projector and clicked on the most recent file. Id sent. I watched my own subject line pop up on the big screen with my name attached, and for about 3 seconds everything was normal. Then the video started, and my brain couldn't quite process what it was seeing. Instead of the opening shot of the mountain valley Id chosen, there was a grainy, underlit video of someone sitting in a dark room, the only light coming from a desk lamp off to the side. They were wearing one of those cheap, ghost-face Halloween masks, the plastic kind that makes the eye holes look like empty wells. Behind them, I could just make out the outline of something like pegboard or rough wooden slats, maybe a basement wall. They weren't just sitting there either. They were talking, and the voice that came out was distorted, pitched down in a way that made it sound inhuman without being anything other than a simple audio filter. They started saying things about me, Dr. Collins, the university, the government, each sentence more vile than the last, weaving in details from my actual life, my major, the freshman dorm ID lived in. Even a joke Id made once in class into these deranged rants. My brain went white-hot with panic. I remember my mouth going dry, my hands gripping the edge of my seat so hard my knuckles hurt, and feeling hundreds of eyes turning toward me even before anyone actually looked. Dr. Collins let the video play for a few seconds longer than he should have, maybe because he was in shock too. Then he fumbled for the keyboard and paused it, his face almost gray in the projection glow. I felt like the room had shrunk around me, like the air had been vacuumed out. My chest wouldn't expand properly, and my peripheral vision tunneled until all I could see was that frozen, masked face on the screen and my own name in the email header above it. After a few seconds of silence that felt like an hour, my body finally moved. I grabbed my bag, stumbled up the aisle, and fled the hall in tears. I ended up outside, standing by the bike racks, trying to breathe through what was clearly a full-blown panic attack. Everything in me wanted to just walk off campus and never come back. But I knew if I didn't at least try to explain, it'd probably get expelled or worse. When class ended, I waited for Dr. Collins in the hallway, eyes still swollen, and poured everything out in this shaky rush. How Id sent him the real video, how something else must have replaced it. He listened, still pale, then admitted there were actually 2 emails from me in his inbox. The original file time-stamped earlier in the evening, and then a second one, sent in the middle of the night, with a nearly identical subject line and that masked video attached. It looked, on the surface, like Id sent both. It took weeks of meetings with the administration and IT to untangle enough of it for them to believe me, but they eventually confirmed what I'd already started to suspect, that my university email had been accessed from an IP that didn't match any of my devices, that my password had been used from somewhere else in town while I was logged in on campus, and that at the very least, someone had inserted that video into my sent folder deliberately. It was humiliating and terrifying at the same time, like a public stripping of any control over how people saw me. I changed my password immediately. Long string of letters and symbols I wrote down and hid, and tried to tell myself it was just a freak incident, that maybe someone had guessed my old, lazy password and done this to mess with me, that lightning wouldn't strike twice, but that illusion lasted less than a week. One morning, I woke up to find I'd been logged out of Snapchat overnight, which only happens when your account has been accessed from another device, and when I tried to sign back in, I saw that the recovery email had been changed. My stomach dropped, because Snapchat was where the more vulnerable parts of my private life lived. Photos and videos I thought were fleeting because they disappeared. Messages I'd sent to Evan when we were still together. Things that felt harmless in the moment, but in the cold light of morning were the kinds of things you never want a stranger to have. I didn't even want to imagine how thoroughly some anonymous person was combing through those pieces of me. I called campus police, and then the actual town police. Told them about the hacked email, the project, the Snapchat lockout, even the nose print on the window and the flash outside. And because I'd already told them about Evan in the incident reports with the university, they went to talk to him. To his credit, he didn't fight it. He let them look through his devices, let them question him about where he'd been, and they eventually cleared him of being the one behind the hacks. But that wasn't the end of his involvement, because in one of the interviews, he admitted that in the raw, angry days right after I blocked him, had posted my Instagram handle, my college email, and a rough description of my photos on a message board Head found through a breakup support subreddit. He swore he hadn't shared any passwords, but he did admit Head used a line like she uses the same dumb password for everything as a sort of bitter jab. What he hadn't realized was that the password he was mocking, some combination of my dog's name and my birth year, was easy enough to guess for anyone willing to try a few variations, especially if they were bored, vindictive, or just looking for a random target. When the police told me that, it was like the floor dropped out from under me, because it meant whoever had slipped under the surface of my accounts wasn't someone I knew. Not Evan punishing me or some jealous friend, but some faceless stranger out there who'd picked me like a username on a list. Someone who knew what I looked like, where I went to school, which building I lived near. Someone who saw my boundaries, not as lines, but as suggestions. I changed every password I could think of then, added two-factor authentication wherever possible, deleted old photos, but deep down I knew that once something is copied out of your control, you can't ever truly pull it back. A few weeks passed without anything obviously new happening, and I let myself believe, for a little while, that maybe whoever it was had gotten bored when the police got involved. Then, on a gray Tuesday afternoon when the mountains were wrapped in low cloud and the sky felt too close, a random account added me on Snapchat. The username was a string of numbers and letters. No Bitmoji, no name, just a blank silhouette. That wasn't unusual by itself. People added each other all the time by mistake. But when I accepted out of habit, thinking maybe it was someone from a group project, they immediately started sending photos. The first was of me walking across campus, head down, headphones in, taken from behind a tree near the library. The second was me in the laundry room of my building, bent over pulling clothes from the dryer, my face partially visible in the reflection of the glass door. And then the third was the one that made my vision swim. It was me in my bedroom, taken at night, lying on my side in bed, facing the window, eyes closed, illuminated by the weak blue light of my charging phone on the nightstand. The angle was low and slightly tilted, as if the photo had been taken either from just outside the window through the gap in the blinds, or from the level of my own phone's front camera, and in the corner of the frame I could see the faint outline of the closet door. a dark crack of space that suddenly felt like a mouth. I blocked the account so fast. I didn't even let myself read whatever caption or message they might have attached. My hands were shaking and I could feel my heartbeat in my teeth. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the building made me flinch. At one point, around 2 a.m., I rolled over and saw my phone screen light up on its own. The camera app opened to the front-facing lens, as if someone had activated it remotely. For a second, my own face stared back at me in the darkness, pale and wide-eyed, and I imagined another screen somewhere else mirroring it, recording. I called the police the next day and showed them what I had, the screenshots, the IP logs from the university IT department, the second Snapchat login notification, and they were sympathetic but honest, without a concrete identity to tie to the accounts, and without a direct threat or demand for money. There wasn't much they could do beyond document everything and advise me to keep securing my accounts. They took it seriously, but the law is slow and the internet is fast. And somewhere in that gap, I was supposed to keep living a normal life, going to class, turning in assignments, pretending not to notice that every time I walked across campus, I felt eyes on me. The third horror detail came not through a screen, but on paper, the oldest medium there is. One afternoon, I came home and saw a single envelope on my doormat. No postage, just my name written in careful block letters. Inside was a printed photo on cheap, glossy paper. One I recognized immediately because I had taken it myself months earlier in a moment of dumb, reckless, trust me, in front of the mirror in my bathroom, wrapped in a towel, smiling at my reflection, Evan's hand just visible on my waist in the corner of the frame. Only in this version, someone had cropped him out entirely and scrawled a neat little line of text in the white border underneath. "You look better alone." I remember sitting down right there on the hallway floor because suddenly my legs didn't feel reliable anymore. It wasn't just the invasion of privacy. It was the deliberate editing of my own memories. A stranger deciding which parts of my life were worth keeping, which ones to erase. By that point, I started living in small, defensive ways. Taping paper over my laptop camera, setting my phone to airplane mode at night, sleeping with a baseball bat under the bed like that would somehow bridge the distance between me and whatever server farm my photos were sitting on. I stopped going out at night unless I absolutely had to. Started checking the gravel below my window every morning. Once I found a small pile of cigarette butts in the exact spot where I used to hear the footsteps, all the same brand with a red ring around the filter, which had never seen anyone on campus smoke. And that image has stayed with me almost more than the photos. The idea of someone standing there in the cold mountain air, cigarette after cigarette burning down between their fingers, staring up at my window, taking their time. Eventually, the direct contact slowed. The random friend requests, the creepy anonymous messages. They didn't stop completely, but they got further apart. Maybe because I stopped accepting anyone I didn't know. Maybe because whoever it was moved on or got scared off by the paper trail. It forced into existence by involving the police, but the damage was done. The part of my brain that used to feel safe inside four walls and a locked door never really came back. I graduated, moved away, got a job in a different Appalachian town with better pay and a building that has cameras in the hallways and key fobs instead of old locks. But there are still nights when I lie in bed and feel my phone heavy on the nightstand like an eye that looks both ways, out and in. People sometimes ask why I don't just get over it. Why I still tape over my laptop camera or flinch when an unknown number calls. And I don't know how to explain that once you've watched your own life turned into content by someone who doesn't even know your middle name, once you've seen your private pain become someone else's entertainment or leverage, trust stops being a default setting and turns into something you have to rebuild from debris. I'm telling this not because I have some neat moral or resolution. I never found out exactly who did it. I never got the satisfying confrontation scene where the villain is unmasked. It just faded into the background noise of my life like a low-level hum of dread. But if you're watching this and you've ever reused a password, kept photos just for you in a folder you think no one will ever find, or brushed off strange noises outside your window as imagination, maybe you'll think twice. And if you were in my position back then, In that little Appalachian apartment with the walls too thin and the night pressing in through the trees, would you have moved? Gone offline completely? Confronted Evan harder? Done something more extreme? Or would you, like me, have tried to walk the line between living your life and not giving whoever it is the satisfaction of seeing you crumble? Tell me in the comments what you honestly think you'd do. Because even now, part of me is still trying to figure out where caution ends and fear begins.